Steve here with a special pants puping episode about social media. Welcome to the quote-unquote podcast. In a segment I call WTFB, or What the Facebook, we're going to talk about a significant blow to knife makers on Instagram. That's right. When Facebook isn't busy selling your private information, reading your passwords, or leaking them by the millions to third parties, they're busy denying knife makers access. Let me explain and prepare thine minds for blowing and thine ear holes for blood loss. I make a series of videos promoting skilled knife makers called Maker's Mark for the YouTube channel. Hopefully you guys have seen that. I pay the people who do it a small amount to participate, and for the last several episodes, I've tried to promote these videos by advertising their existence on Instagram, as in like paid promotions, sending them out, paying for clicks, etc., in an effort to increase exposure of these knife makers. And I lose money on this because these videos don't make much money at all, in fact, hardly any. Instagram ran a Kyle Royer interview promotion for a few days, but when I tried to advertise Stuart Smith video, they rejected it and pulled Kyle's ad simultaneously. They said they cannot promote the sale of knives, guns, or weapons on their platform. So I appealed this, noting that these promotions were advertising interviews with extremely skilled craftsmen, which worked for about half a day. And then the ads were almost immediately taken down again. And so I appealed it again, and in the end, I got a very similar response. We're sorry, no knives or knife paraphernalia. Then I pointed out to them that I am constantly served ads on Instagram that ask me to promote my own posts, and they show pictures of my posts with knives in them. I mentioned that I am also served ads for kitchen knives and knife sharpeners and knife making supplies. And basically their response was kitchen knives are okay. Now I'll point out that the sale of kitchen knives are restricted in Great Britain, but that doesn't seem to bother Facebook. The sale of knives like kitchen knives or anything else, other knives, are not restricted in the United States for the most part, and yet we're suffering under these advertising issues. Am I blowing this out of proportion, or is this some sort of existential threat to knife making on social media? I worry about it. I think it's significant. I see these three areas of exclusion for content makers and participation in the marketplace on social media, knife making content makers. And some are more important than others. One probably represents suppression of free speech, and I think that's something we should focus on here in a little bit. But we really should be concerned about all three areas because they exist on the same spectrum, right? And there's just part of this slippery slope. The first area is essentially content demonetization on platforms like YouTube. So these platforms don't have to serve ads on the content I make or knife makers make or gun channels make if advertisers don't want to be associated with that. There's probably no violation of free speech here. These are private companies that maintain their own standards. They cannot force advertisers into relationships that those advertisers don't want to be in, right? The larger issue here for me is whether or not these norms and preferences to which these platforms and advertisers adhere to are healthy or are informed or are truly representative of society's values. So just because this type of discrimination might happen to us against knife makers and knife-related content makers is legal in this sense, it doesn't mean that it's okay with me, and it shouldn't really be okay with you or other knife makers or knife aficionados, collectors. I've certainly had videos demonetized, but appealing them, they were reinstated. Others haven't been as fortunate, and certainly firearms channels and firearms-related content has had no luck at all. And I think that's when I look to the future, that's the future I fear. The same treatment as is currently seen by the firearms industry. Whether or not you agree with firearms and all that is a separate issue. The fact is, firearms are illegal in one form or another, vastly similar forms throughout the United States. They are widely embraced by a large number of people, and yet they're excluded from marketplaces routinely. And their content is not as excluded from advertisements and things like that. In the second level of hell, we see what happened to me here on Instagram. Exclusion of products or ideas from a marketplace based solely on moralistic or political viewpoints, as I just pointed out with guns. So you're saying, Steve, is it really a big deal if you're not allowed to advertise knife maker interviews on Facebook? Probably not the end of the world, but I think it's an unreasonable standard for Facebook to have. In fact, I think it's outrageous, to be honest. I mean, by their logic, they really shouldn't allow kitchen knives. Knife makers are not illegal. Interviews with knife makers are not illegal. Kitchen knives are extremely regulated in London right now. You have to be 18 or older to buy a kitchen knife. There's legislation being considered that would take the points off of kitchen knives for everybody. What about car advertisements? Cars are used in terrorist attacks to mow down civilians in crowded areas. I mean, again, my fear is that knives are starting down the path of firearms. You can look at Google, which suppresses firearm search results, right? If you go search buy gun, stuff like that, you have to go deep to get to a place that sells guns. They keep guns and firearms out of their shopping feed. PayPal will not process payments for firearms. Other credit card processors and banks similarly treat firearms. And I've seen and heard of people who can't sell knives. PayPal won't process their payments for knives and knife making stuff. I've never had a problem with that, and I don't think that's usually the case. But you can see that we're right there on the cusp of being treated like firearms, and it scares me. And again, these are in venues and in areas where these goods and services are 100% legal, and in many cases embraced by the local community. In other words, there's no conflict generated amongst the rural community in Alabama or Texas or Oklahoma, where I live, when people see ads for firearms or knives on the internet. It's just that Google, Facebook, and Twitter don't like those things. And again, these are private companies or platforms who have their own standards for advertiser content that are, they're not obligated to advertise or promote products or to provide paid access to markets for products with which they disagree. And in some cases, my values align with these platforms, and yours probably do too. For example, I don't want to see porn, sexually explicit content, violence, gore promoted in advertising on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, anything else. I'm sorry Patreon embraces pornographers, so that's, the ironies there is incredible. But in other cases, such as in my inability to promote an interview with an extremely skilled craftsman, I couldn't disagree more. But in their defense, they're under increasing scrutiny by their advertisers. So is YouTube. There's an article on CNBC this past week about the World Federation of Advertisers, a group that buys $1 trillion of advertising per year for its members across the world. They basically came up with a list of demands for Google and Facebook to clean up their acts via YouTube and Instagram. They were tired of their members' companies being associated with this questionable content or had content with which they didn't agree. And ads are the lifeblood of these companies. They're literally the reason they exist. All right, so the third thing I've observed, sort of the third level of suppression, is of particular concern. And this is sort of where we get into the free speech type of thing. So Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Patreon, and payment processors have demonstrated that they are willing to go one step further and actively censor individuals based on the content of their speech by removing their content and their presence from their platforms entirely, even in cases where their own terms of service are not violated. And, I won't go into the specifics. There's been a lot of examples of these things recently. Can a company in that way deny what is essentially free speech to an individual? And I don't know the answer to that. Again, this is what's called deplatforming. It goes beyond the denial of marketplace participation. It goes into the suppression of free speech, essentially, which is protected under the law in all but extreme cases. Now that I'm aware, a knife maker has not ever been deplatformed, at least not for knife making. And I'm not sure we ever will be, but one can argue that gun makers and gun retailers are not far off. What's really scary to me is PayPal's willingness to refuse processing or baking services to some knife makers, and MasterCard's willingness to undertake similar things when they've had Patreon deplatform people based on MasterCard's political views, for example. This is a huge issue. Debanking is a crazy big issue. That's people's livelihoods, right? That's total disenfranchisement from the economy and society, basically, right? One of the huge goals in alleviating poverty in our country, but especially third world countries, is to get people banked, to get them credit, save money, have them apply for loans, bring them into the economy. Banking is a huge deal. Debanking and being unbanked, it's huge. It is a huge deal. I can't say that enough. But what do you guys think? Will custom knife makers experience deplatforming or escalating disenfranchisement? Will knife images be suppressed on Pinterest in the future, for example? What about knife auctions on Instagram or eBay? Well, I suggest we're already being disenfranchised, as seen by Instagram's actions with me and by certain payment processors with other knife makers. I think the next domino to fall would be YouTube's demonetization of knife-related content. Again, we're on the cusp of that. My videos have been picked up. They're right on the edge. That stuff is right on the edge of their algorithm and of their values and where they draw the line. And they cross over into knife making content fairly routinely, and it can be pushed back with manual review, but it just shows how close we are. So it all feels like a slippery slope to me. I'm worried about it. What do you guys think?